Our scriptures today looks at the story known as the Gerasene demonic. We're no longer following the Lent Easter cycle. We've gone back to an earlier part in the scriptures that we had completely jumped over in order to start the Lenten process. So we're going back and we're looking more at some of the teachings and stories and healings of Jesus along the way. The first one we're looking at is Gerasene demonic. Now, this is a series and a bunch of healings that Jesus does really early in his ministry. And in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus' followers, closest followers, know there's something about this guy, but they do not know who Jesus really is or what is going on. So we're back to apostles and disciples, followers who are seeing him as a great teacher, but not God incarnate. So we have this situation set up. Gerasene, as we're told through the scriptures, is on the other side of the Galilean Sea, which means it's in Gentile territory. So already we are going out of the comfort zone of Jesus and his followers. Our first indication, or one of our first indications, that the gospel is not just for the Hebrew people, which is kind of controversial, shall we say, in the first centuries. So Jesus is in the boat, goes over, and is walking for some reason around the graves. Why he's there, we don't know. But he encounters this being, this naked being who's screaming and rushing at him and shouting in gibberish and who knows what is going on, but making threatening gestures and telling Jesus to leave him alone. And then he identifies Jesus. This is kind of interesting because none of the people who are following, who are closest to Jesus, has been able to identify him. But this possessed person gets it in one. From there, there's conversation going on. Jesus asks what his name is. He tells him his legion, which is very significant. We'll come back to that in a minute. And then he follows through and heals the person, sends the demons out into a herd of pigs that are on the field. The pigs run off into the lake and they drown themselves. And then the townspeople come and they see who Jesus is talking to, what's going on. They see that something has changed and they get scared. They get really, really terrified and tell both men to leave. They don't want them anywhere near their town. But Jesus says to the man he's just healed that we never actually learn the name of. Go back to the town and tell people about God. So he goes back to the town and tells them about Jesus. So let's break that down a little bit because it's a very familiar story, but it's also a very uncomfortable story. And there's many ways to look at it, both through our 21st century eyes as well as the first century eyes that would have heard this for the first time. Our 20th century eyes are always looking for what is demon possession because a good chunk of Christianity does not believe in actual possession of people. So mental health, mental illness is always the go-to. Is this a mental health issue? Is this a situation where Jesus cures someone of the demons? And if you've ever spent time talking with people who have issues in mental health, they will refer to it as demon possession in a lot of ways, taking over them, making them do things that they really don't want to do. Is that what's going on here? Could be, but we have to walk very, very delicately in this. Because remember, there's a healing, and all the legion that is disturbing this person is removed. That's not quite what happens in our modern day when mental health is dealt with. It's not as simple as praying it away and it's all gone. It's an illness. It's like any other illness. It's got to be treated or it's going to continue to come back and make things worse. It's not a one and done. And far too many people in certain circles in the Christian family think it is. All they have to do is take it to Jesus and they can get cured and it's all gone. And that creates a whole lot of problems for the person and for the family and friends supporting them. So we have to be very careful not to make this into a Jesus can cure mental health story. That's not helpful. Because in the end, the families and the friends of the person who knew this man, they're not accepting that he's been cured. There's no joy here. There's no happy celebration. There's no he's lost and now he's found kind of reaction. That doesn't exist. They're terrified. They want him gone. They had locked him up. They had left him around the ruins. They had left him in shackles. Both his legs and his hands were tied up, and he'd managed to break free. He was a scary presence. So to preach that this is simply a story of mental health, not helpful. Another question that comes up is about the pigs. Now, that's a real 21st century question because none of the Hebrews in the first or second century would have cared two figs about the pigs because that was a Gentile form of meat that the Hebrews were not eating. It didn't matter to them. A few less pigs, means more grazing rights for them, maybe. Who knows? But the question of the pig always kind of takes over. Like, why did Jesus send this into the pigs? The short answer to that story is that's the part that's definitely not written for us. That's the part that's written for the Hebrew people of the first and second century who wouldn't have cared. And a lot of ink is actually spilled over both mental health and the pig thing. And both reduce the story because I think there's something else going on. So those are our 21st century questions. But what are the first and second century questions? That's where it gets really quite interesting because Legion, as the name this demonic creature gives, is reminiscent of the Roman legion, of course. There was nothing else in that day and age. We've come now in modernity to see legion as meaning a large number. But at that time, that's not what it meant. It meant the military, the Roman military. And while the actual location of Gerasene is still up for grabs, Josephus, one of the early church historians, did talk about an attack on a town that had a name very similar to Gerasene around 60 CE, where the Roman legions went in. They killed every man who was of military fighting age. They took the women and children, and basically the town was gutted. They burned it down to nothingness. So if this was around 60 and Luke is writing around 90, that story is still pretty fresh in the public. So here we have a story of Jesus confronting this entity that calls itself Legion, which cannot help but identify with the Roman authority, the Roman occupation that these people are enduring. And Jesus comes in and sends it away. The Legion recognizes who Jesus is, recognizes Jesus' power, says, "Don't send me back to the dark place." So Jesus sends it somewhere else, into a group of pigs who go and drown themselves in the lake. But honors the request, but does not leave the possession within the man. He cleans that out. Now, what can we glean from this, aside from a voice of hope? That Jesus coming in is also an opportunity, a long hoped for opportunity to get rid of the Romans, to have some political autonomy, to have a lot of the pain that the Romans have created removed from society. So the Gerasene demonic might even not be representative only of Gerasene or that tragedy that happened in that town, but for all of the Hebrew people, all of the people who were under Roman occupation. This hope that Jesus would get rid of the occupation. But again, as we talked about through most of Lent and Easter, the assumptions about the Messiah, the assumptions about God incarnate and what that power was going to mean did not get fulfilled. Instead, Jesus brought a whole other avenue of thinking. Physically, politically, not much changed. Socially, communally, a whole lot changed. And I think we can take some of that messaging out of the story because towards the end, Jesus gives this man instructions. Again, never found out his name, never gave him an identity, kept him an anonymous soul, gave him the dignity of clothing, however, gave him the dignity of returning in restoration to his community, but moved this person into a position of missionary to his own people, people who didn't want him, people who rejected him, people who were scared of him. Jesus still told him, go back to the town, tell them your story, tell them what has happened, tell them what has changed. And he goes back, and he identifies Jesus with God. Now, there's a number of scholars that will say, well, he was supposed to talk about God, but talked about Jesus instead. Well, that kind of makes you trip over Trinitarian theology. The whole idea that Jesus sent him to talk to the very people who were scared of him about how his life changed, how his circumstances had changed. He was still a citizen under Roman occupation. He was still someone that, as far as we know, without employment, without opportunity, without support, without family, but something changed in him. And that is the hope that Jesus brings. Whether we're talking about 21st century mental health and mental illness, or physical health and physical illness, or whether we're talking about first century and second century political realities, Jesus, it brings hope. Not necessarily the way we expect it to come, but hope nonetheless. And then challenges us to do something really hard, and that's to talk about it with the people we know. There is nothing easier than walking into a group of strangers and talking about this stuff, because at the end of the day, well, I say easier for people like me who like to talk a lot. At the end of the day, their opinion of you doesn't matter. But when you return to the people who watched you grow up, who watched you get sick, who watched you fall apart, who tried to help and they couldn't, to go back to that community and tell them about the hope and the transformation you experience personally is incredibly hard. And yet this is what Jesus asked him to do. After just being healed, he now has to risk again in a whole new way. But he's now carrying the truth and the hope that Jesus has given him. The game has changed. That's what we can take away from this. That Jesus may ask us the hard stuff, but will always give us the hope, always give us the message, always give us the words to share. If others will listen or not is not really up to us. Our job is just to share the message, to get the word out, no matter what the circumstances were previously. Our transformation in Christ means that we are now commissioned to share that good news with everybody we encounter.